Good evening, and welcome back. I'm glad you found your way here tonight, wherever you're listening from. If this is the first time you've settled in with me, my name doesn't matter half as much as the story does. And tonight's story is one I've been saving for a quiet, dark room like the one you're probably in right now. So before we begin, let the lights go all the way down if they aren't already. Put the phone face down on the nightstand. You won't need it for this. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the blanket settle where it wants to settle, and stop trying so hard to stay awake for me. That was never the point of these evenings. If you'd like, leave a comment before your eyes close all the way and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I like knowing who's out there in the dark with me. And now, let's begin. There was a bridge across a bay that, for most of its life, carried more crossings in a single day than any bridge anywhere on the earth. Trucks and commuters and streetcars, and later a river of headlights that never really stopped, morning or night, moving between a city on a peninsula and the flatter, quieter land on the other side of the water. It had stood through the better part of a century of use, through wars fought and ended, through the slow rebuilding of the world around it, carrying its traffic with the sort of dependability that people stop noticing after a while. The way you stop noticing a flaw is holding you up until one evening, for just a moment, it doesn't. That evening came in October, and what makes it worth telling isn't really the shaking itself, though the shaking matters. It's what was left afterward, on the upper deck, where for as long as anyone could remember there had always been a road. A whole section of that roadway, a slab of the upper deck wide enough to have carried lanes of cars only seconds before, was simply gone. Not damaged, not sagging. Gone, dropped down onto the deck below it, leaving a gap in the roadway you could have driven straight through in the dark without ever knowing it was there until it was far too late to stop. Picture it from where you'd have been standing if you'd been on that lower deck when it happened, looking up at the underside of the upper roadway the way you'd look up at a ceiling. And then picture that ceiling arriving. That's the image this whole story is going to keep circling back to. Not the fear of it, but the plain fact of it. A piece of a great and trusted structure simply not being where it had always been. Everything else in this story, the engineers, the piers, the steel, the men who raised it, all of it eventually has to answer to that one dropped slab of roadway, because that's where the truth of how the thing was actually built finally came due. The bridge is the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, and the evening was in 1989, though I'll ask you to hold that year loosely rather than tightly, the way you'd hold a coin you're not spending yet. There's no test tonight. You don't have to remember any of this to enjoy hearing it, and if your eyes are already drifting shut, that's exactly where you're supposed to be. But a story about a fall has to start, as most of these stories do, with a rise. And this rise began with a man whose name the record keeps carefully, because his signature is on the drawings. Charles H. Purcell was the chief engineer given charge of building a crossing that, when it was proposed, plenty of serious people believed could not be built at all, not across water that deep, not across a bay floor that behaved so strangely underfoot, not with the bridge-building knowledge of his day. Purcell is the man you'll meet again and again in this story, standing at drafting tables, standing on barges, standing in hearing rooms defending numbers that other men doubted. He is not the only figure worth knowing here, though. Beside him, and beneath him in every sense, stood the men who actually raised the steel, riveters and cablemen and derrick operators working out over open water on platforms that swayed when the wind came through the gate. One of them, a foreman who oversaw a gang of iron workers on the high steel, appears in the photographs and the newspaper accounts of the day without a name attached, the way thousands of working men appear in the record of almost every great structure ever built, present in every frame, absent from every caption. I'll keep returning to him across these 2 hours, not as one man, but as a kind of stand-in for all of them, because somebody has to carry that memory forward, and the paperwork never did. So let me ask you the question this whole story is quietly built around, the same question that must have moved through that lower deck in the seconds after the slab came down. How does something raised with that much confidence by men who understood their trade as well as any engineers of their age come to fail at all? And what does a failure like that actually tell you about the ground it was standing on the whole time? That's not a question I'm going to answer quickly, and I don't think you'd want me to. We have 2 hours together tonight, and I intend to use them the way the bridge itself was built, patiently, one pier and one span at a time, starting long before any steel touched the water. If you're the sort of listener who likes to know how a story ends before you let yourself relax into it, I can tell you this much now. The bridge did not fall. Only a portion of one deck did, in one place, for one night. And the story of why is really a story about a bay floor nobody ever fully trusted, no matter how confident the men standing above it managed to sound. Before we go there, though, I want to say one more small thing, and then I'll let the story carry you rather than me. If you've enjoyed settling in with stories like this one, there are more of them waiting for you here on the channel, and I'd be glad to have you subscribe so the next one finds you the way this one did, quietly and at the right hour. That's the last I'll mention it tonight. Now let's go back to the beginning, long before the fall, long before the bridge even had a name, to a bay that everyone agreed needed crossing and almost no one agreed could actually be crossed. You have to understand what that stretch of water looked like to the people standing on its edges, because the difficulty of the bay is the whole reason this story has an engineer in it at all, rather than just a crew of laborers following somebody else's simple instructions. The bay was wide. First of all, wider than most rivers anyone building bridges in that era had ever spanned, and it was deep in places where deep water makes every problem underneath a foundation harder rather than easier. Ferries had carried people back and forth across it for generations. Fine, steady boats that did the job well enough that for a long time, nobody thought too hard about replacing them. But a ferry can only carry so many people, and a city growing the way that city was growing eventually runs out of patience for boats. You'd have felt that impatience if you'd stood on the waterfront in those years, watching the queues for the ferry stretch longer on a foggy morning than anyone had the temper for. The idea of a bridge had been talked about for decades before anyone with real authority took it seriously, partly because talking is free and bridges across water that deep are not, and partly because the engineers who did look seriously at the bay kept finding reasons to hesitate. The currents moved strangely through the middle of it. The floor of the bay, where anyone would eventually need to sink a foundation, was not the kind of solid rock a bridge builder dreams about. It was soft in places, deep in others, and nobody standing on the shore could tell you with any confidence what 50 feet down actually looked like without going and finding out the hard way. That hesitation is where Purcell steps properly into the story, because the state eventually needed someone willing to say, with his name attached, that the crossing could be done, and done safely, and done within a budget the public could be persuaded to pay for. He came to the job with a background in bridges elsewhere, a reputation for being careful rather than flashy, and the particular kind of stubbornness that a project like this required, because every fresh survey of the bay floor seemed to bring back some new complication that a less patient man might have used as an excuse to walk away. There's a soft, easy comfort in imagining engineering as pure certainty. Steel behaves the way the tables say it behaves. Concrete cures the way the mixed design predicts, and a well-drawn plan simply becomes a well-built structure. Purcell knew better than that, and so did everyone who worked under him. Bridges are agreements with uncertainty as much as they are triumphs over it. You lay a foundation, and you trust that the ground will still be doing in 50 years roughly what it appeared to be doing on the day you tested it. Most of the time, that trust is rewarded. The story we're telling tonight is, in part, the story of the one bay floor in this account that didn't entirely keep its end of the bargain, though that reckoning was still decades away while Purcell and his surveyors were out on the water in small boats, sounding the bottom, wondering exactly how deep down they'd have to go before they found something solid enough to build on. If your eyes have already closed, let this next part simply move past you like weather. There's nothing here you need to hold on to, only a bay, a city hungry for a crossing, and a careful man beginning to believe the crossing might actually be possible. What the surveys slowly revealed, foot by foot, sounding by sounding, was a bay that changed its mind depending on where in it you were standing. Toward one shore, the rock came up close enough to reach with the tools of the day. Toward the middle, and especially where the ground dropped away into the bay's deeper basin, The bottom kept receding the further the drilling crews chased it, through layer after layer of soft material that told the engineers nothing they wanted to hear. A pier built on rock behaves one way under load. A pier built on anything softer behaves another way entirely, and the gap between those two behaviors is where an engineer's confidence either holds or quietly starts to erode. You can imagine the temperament this called for in the men doing that work. Not boldness exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but a kind of patient suspicion of the ground itself, a refusal to take the bay's word for anything until it had been drilled and sampled and drilled again. That suspicion would prove, many decades later, to have been entirely justified, though not everywhere, and not evenly. Some sections of that bay floor turned out to be every bit as trustworthy as the surveys suggested. Others turned out to be holding a secret they wouldn't reveal until the ground itself was asked by an earthquake to do something no drawing had ever modeled. But that reckoning belongs later in the story, on a specific evening in a specific October, and I don't want to rush toward it the way the traffic once rushed across that upper deck without a thought in the world. Tonight we have time, and the bridge, when it was finally approved and funded and set in motion, took its own good time too. Years of surveying before a single pier was sunk. Years more of design arguments over how such different ground on either half of the crossing could possibly be answered with one continuous structure. Purcell's solution, and the solutions of the engineers working alongside him, would eventually divide the crossing itself into two very different kinds of bridge joined near the middle of the bay, on a small outcrop of rock that must have felt, to the surveyors who first found it, like the answer to a prayer they hadn't quite dared to say out loud. That island, and the reasons it mattered so much to everything built on either side of it, is where the next part of this story properly begins. But before we get there, I want to stay a little longer with the ordinary texture of that early work, the men in small boats with sounding lines, the foreman who would later climb far higher than any boat, the slow accumulation of confidence that a bridge here was not just possible but inevitable. It's a quiet, unglamorous kind of beginning for a structure that would eventually carry more of the world's daily traffic than almost any crossing built before it. And there's something worth sitting with in that quietness before the steel starts to rise, before the concrete starts to pour, before the bay finally meets the bridge that so many people insisted for so long it could never hold. There is a particular kind of frustration that does not announce itself with anger. It simply accumulates, morning after morning, in the small delays of ordinary life, a missed connection, a cold cup of coffee taken standing up, a newspaper read twice because the crossing takes longer than the reading. That was the frustration gathering around the bay in those years, long before anyone had drawn a single span on paper. Two cities faced each other across open water, close enough that on a clear evening you could watch the lights come on in windows you would never walk past, and far enough that reaching them meant giving yourself over to a schedule that belonged to somebody else. You did not decide when you crossed. The water decided, and the boats that worked it decided. And you simply arranged your life around whatever room was left over. If you have ever lain awake listening to a foghorn somewhere out past a window, low and patient and utterly unhurried, you already know something of the sound this story begins with. Let that sound settle over you now. There is nothing you need to hold on to here, only the sense of two shores, close enough to see and far enough to matter, waiting for something neither of them yet had the confidence to build. For all the years before this story turns to steel, the crossing belonged to the ferries. They were dependable in the way that old, well-tended machines are dependable, sturdy hulls, steady engines, captains who could find the slip in weather that would have frightened a less practiced hand. If you had wanted to travel from one shore to the other on an ordinary weekday, you would have joined a crowd on a wooden pier, smelled the tar and the salt and the faint diesel breath of the engines idling below, and waited your turn among commuters, crates of produce, delivery wagons, and eventually, as the years wore on, an increasingly restless swarm of automobiles nosing forward toward the loading ramps. The ferries were not a failure. They were, in fact, remarkably good at the job they had been built for. The trouble was that the job itself was changing faster than any fleet of boats could grow to meet it. You would have felt that change most sharply if you owned one of the automobiles now filling the ferry slips in numbers nobody had quite planned for. A ferry that could comfortably carry a modest number of wagons and a crowd of walking passengers found itself instead trying to load queues of motorcars that stretched back along the waterfront streets. Engines idling, drivers leaning out of windows to see how much further the line had to go. On a bad morning, you might sit through 2 or 3 sailings before your vehicle nosed onto the deck, and once aboard, you would have felt the boat settle lower in the water than it once had, laden with more weight than its designers ever pictured crossing at once. Freight companies felt it too, in a more expensive way. A truck loaded with goods bound from one shore to the other did not simply lose time in the queue, it lost money for every hour that truck and its cargo sat idle instead of moving. Warehouse owners, cannery operators, produce shippers, all of them watched the ferry schedules with the same private irritation, doing arithmetic in their heads about how much faster and how much cheaper this same journey could be if the water were not standing in the way at all. Civic leaders on both shores heard this irritation constantly because it was their business to hear it. If you had sat in on one of the Chamber of Commerce meetings held in those years, you would have found the conversation circling again and again, back to the same complaint dressed in different clothing. The ferries were slow, the ferries were crowded, the ferries were, however well run, a bottleneck that both cities had simply grown too large to tolerate. Oakland wanted easier access to the commerce and the population of San Francisco. San Francisco, for its part, worried quietly about being outpaced by cities that had already begun linking themselves by road and rail in ways the Bay's peninsular geography made naturally difficult. There is a kind of anxiety that grows in a city that senses it might be left behind by its own neighbors, and you can hear the edges of that anxiety in the newspaper editorials and civic pamphlets of the period, in their talk of progress, of destiny, of a bay that had for too long been allowed to divide what modern engineering elsewhere in the country was already learning to join. None of this made the idea of a bridge inevitable yet. It only made it desired, which is a different thing and often a much smaller thing than people imagine. Because if you had proposed the idea itself out loud in a public meeting in the early years of the century, you would have been met with the particular kind of polite skepticism reserved for schemes considered charming rather than serious. The bay was wide. Its waters were deep in places and treacherous in others, its floor uncertain, its currents unpredictable in the way that any large body of water fed by a river system and tempered by an ocean tends to be unpredictable. Engineers of an earlier generation had looked at similar crossings elsewhere and shaken their heads, not because the idea itself was impossible in some abstract sense, but because nothing quite like it existed yet to prove the case. The tools of long-span construction were still relatively young. The confidence to gamble enormous sums of money on a structure this ambitious, resting on foundations nobody had properly tested, simply had not yet arrived. So for years the idea sat quietly in the background of civic conversation, occasionally raised, occasionally studied, never quite gathering the momentum required to become more than a hopeful sketch in somebody's desk drawer. So what finally changed? What turned a hopeful sketch, filed away and reconsidered every so often out of habit, into something that suddenly felt not just desirable, but achievable, even urgent? Part of the answer lies in the shifting relationship between the state and the ambitions its people had begun to hold. California, like much of the country in the years leading toward the bridge's construction, was wrestling with a new question about what state government was actually for. There had always been a comfortable assumption that great crossings, great harbors, great public works belonged either to private companies chasing profit or to a patchwork of local authorities too small and too underfunded to attempt anything truly large. But the Bay Crossing was too big for any single city to fund alone, and too central to the state's economic life to be left entirely to private enterprise, which had shown little appetite for a project this uncertain and this expensive. Slowly, cautiously, the idea took hold that this was a project the state itself might need to sponsor, not merely encourage from a comfortable distance, but actually organize, finance, and see through. If you had followed the political debates of the period closely, you would have noticed a subtle but important shift in language, away from talk of private franchises and toward talk of public authority, state bonds, and a crossing built for the collective benefit of everyone who would ever use it. That shift mattered enormously because it opened a door that had been stubbornly shut before. A structure of this scale needed money that no toll-hungry private company could easily raise on its own, and it needed a kind of legal authority to acquire land, to negotiate rights of way, to coordinate an effort spanning two cities and the water between them, that only a properly empowered public body could provide. California's leaders began moving deliberately and without great fanfare at first toward creating exactly that kind of authority. A body with the power to study the crossing seriously, to commission real engineering surveys instead of hopeful sketches, and eventually to borrow the money needed to build. It is worth resting a moment on how unglamorous this stage of the story actually was. There were no ribbons cut, no crowds gathered, no photographs taken of anyone standing proudly over a hole in the ground. There were only meetings and reports, and the slow, grinding work of turning a popular wish into something with legal teeth. And then, not long after that machinery had begun turning, the wider country's fortunes shifted in a way nobody in those early planning meetings could have fully anticipated. The nation slid into an economic depression that emptied factories, closed banks, and left enormous numbers of able men without work of any kind. It is a grim backdrop, and it deserves to be treated with the same quiet respect the rest of this story tries to hold, because out of that hardship came, almost paradoxically, one of the conditions that finally made a bridge across the bay possible. Public works of exactly this scale suddenly became not just desirable in the abstract, but politically urgent in the most practical sense. A project that could employ thousands of idle hands, that could pour concrete and rivet steel and put wages back into pockets that had gone empty, carried a weight of purpose beyond mere convenience. Federal backing, in the form of loans made available to support exactly this kind of ambitious infrastructure, suddenly stood ready in a way it never had before. If you imagine the mood of those years, the anxious newspapers, the long queues outside employment offices, you can also imagine how a bridge across the bay, framed correctly, began to look less like an extravagance and more like a lifeline for the region's economy and for a great many families waiting for exactly this kind of work. It is a strange thing to sit with, if you let yourself, that the hardship of an entire nation helped clear the final obstacles standing in the way of one of its most ambitious structures. There is no tidy moral to draw from that, and this story will not try to draw one. It is simply what happened, the frustration of the ferries, the slow gathering of state authority, and the sudden, unexpected leverage of federal money arriving together, almost by coincidence, at precisely the moment the bay's two cities had finally run out of patience with the water between them. But knowing that a bridge had become politically possible tells you nothing yet about what such a bridge would actually have to be, or how strange and difficult a thing it was being asked to do. Because this was never going to be a simple matter of stretching a single span from one shore to the other, the way a much smaller river crossing might be imagined. The bay itself refused to cooperate with anything that tidy. Between the two cities lay open water broad enough to test any single span ever attempted, and roughly at its center, almost as if placed there by some indifferent hand, sat an island, rocky, modest in size, entirely unsuited to easy human use, and yet perfectly positioned to serve as a stepping stone for anyone stubborn enough to consider building across it rather than simply around it. Beyond that island lay more open water again, and beyond that, closer to the second shore, a channel deep enough and busy enough with shipping traffic that any crossing would have to somehow arch high above it, leaving generous headroom for the masts and superstructures of vessels that had no intention of altering their routes for anyone's convenience. If you had stood on the deck of one of those ferries during this period of planning, looking out across the water while engineers somewhere on shore pored over survey charts, you might have found it almost impossible to picture a bridge fitting into that view at all. The distance alone was daunting enough. This was not a modest span connecting two riverbanks a few hundred feet apart. This was a crossing that would eventually need to reach across a distance longer than anything bridged before it, broken not into one elegant, continuous structure, but into distinct sections, each with its own engineering demands, stitched together across open water over an island and above a channel that shipping companies were not about to abandon just because somebody wanted to build overhead. Whoever eventually took charge of this project would not be designing a bridge in the singular sense at all. They would be designing what amounted to several bridges of different characters and different demands, joined into a single continuous crossing that had never quite been attempted at this scale anywhere else in the world. And beneath all of that ambition, hidden under the surface of water that looked from any ferry deck calm enough to be trusted, lay the one problem that would end up shaping almost every decision made in the years that followed. A problem nobody standing on the shore could see, and one that mattered more than any of the engineers debating span lengths and steel tonnage yet fully understood. The bay's floor was not uniform, it was not simple. In places, it offered firm rock close enough to the surface to build upon with real confidence, and in other places it dropped away into soft, uncertain mud that seemed to swallow whatever was lowered into it, offering no clear answer to the question every bridge in the world eventually has to answer: what exactly will hold this weight and for how long? Small boats had already begun working out across that water quietly, without much notice from the newspapers still busy debating financing and federal loans. Men aboard them lowered lines into the water, felt for the bottom, hauled the lines back up, and recorded what they found, patient measurement after patient measurement, building a private, invisible map of a floor. No one on either shore had ever needed to understand this closely before. Among them, though the records do not preserve his name any more than they preserve the names of most of the men who did this early, unglamorous work, was a foreman who would later climb far higher above the water than any of those small boats ever floated. A man who spent these quiet early seasons learning the bay from underneath before he ever stood above it. If your eyes have already grown heavy somewhere in the middle of all this, that is exactly as it should be. None of these details are ones you need to carry forward, only ones worth letting drift past you, the way the sounding lines drifted down into water nobody yet fully trusted. None of what those men found in the mud and the rock below would be settled for some time yet, and none of it would be simple. But it was already becoming clear, even in these early surveys, that the bay's floor was going to matter far more than the politicians securing loans or the civic leaders drafting proud editorials yet realized. The bridge that would eventually rise above this water would only ever be as strong as whatever those foremen and their small crews found waiting beneath it. And it is to the engineers who had to reckon with exactly that uncertainty, the men who would soon be asked to design something the bay had never been asked to carry before, that this story now quietly turns. You would have known him by his quiet, the kind of quiet that men wear when they have already carried heavy things and expect to carry more. Charles H. Purcell did not look like a man about to be handed the largest engineering commission on the western edge of the continent, and that was, in its way, exactly the point. He had built roads through country that swallowed roads whole. He had strung crossings over rivers that flooded without warning. He had spent a working life learning that the ground does not care how confident you are, and that the water cares even less. And by the time California came looking for someone to answer for a bridge across its great bay, Purcell had already answered for enough smaller failures and smaller successes that the state believed he might be trusted with something this large. There is nothing you need to hold on to here except the shape of the trust itself. A state, uncertain and hopeful in equal measure, placing its faith in one engineer's steady hands, and that engineer accepting a weight he could not yet fully calculate. You have to imagine what it must have felt like to stand in his position at a desk somewhere in Sacramento or San Francisco with survey reports piling higher than any single bridge project had ever produced before, and to understand that whatever he decided in the coming months would either hold for generations or fail in a way that no engineer wants attached to his name. Purcell had been named Chief Engineer of the Crossing, a title that sounds administrative until you consider what it actually meant in practice. Every calculation, every design choice, every argument between competing schools of engineering thought would eventually need to pass across his desk and receive his signature, his judgment, his willingness to stake a career on it. He had earned his reputation the unglamorous way, through highway work and smaller river crossings, where the stakes, while real, were nothing like this. Nothing in his earlier career had prepared him, because nothing in anyone's earlier career could have prepared them. No bridge like this had been built before, not because no one had thought of it, but because the bay itself had never been crossed at this scale, in this depth of water, against currents this restless. If your eyes are already growing heavy, let this settle over you slowly. The responsibility placed on Purcell was not simply to design a bridge, but to design two different kinds of bridge, and somehow make the joining between them invisible to anyone who drove across it. That is the detail worth carrying into sleep tonight, if you carry anything at all. That this crossing was never one structure pretending to be simple, but two entirely different engineering philosophies, meeting in the middle of a bay and somehow needing to behave as though they had always belonged together. Purcell did not work alone, of course. No engineer of this scale ever does, and beneath him gathered a staff of designers and specialists, men who had studied suspension bridges on one hand and cantilever and truss structures on the other, each bringing expertise that the bay's geography demanded in different measures depending on where you stood upon it. But it was Purcell's name that would be spoken in hearings. Purcell's judgment that legislators and skeptical newspapermen would press against, and Purcell who had to hold the whole shape of the project in his mind, even while his engineers worked out its individual pieces. You can imagine him at night, long after the drafting rooms had emptied, still turning over the soundings and the survey lines, still trying to see the bridge complete before a single pier had been sunk. And it was there, in that turning over of soundings and survey lines, that the true design problem finally revealed itself. Not a problem of ambition, which California had in generous supply, but a problem of geography that no amount of ambition could simply argue away. But how do you design a single crossing over water that behaves like two entirely different bodies within the same bay? That was the question waiting at the center of every drafting table, and it was not a question with a tidy answer. The western reach of the bay, the stretch nearest San Francisco itself, dropped away into water deep enough and wide enough that only a suspension design could hope to leap it. Long cables strung between towers, the roadway hanging below like a curtain drawn taut across the gap. You would have felt the logic of it immediately if you had stood on the shoreline and looked west. Nothing but open water, no convenient islands, no shallow shelf to plant a pier upon, just the kind of distance that only a suspension span, with its long, unsupported reach, could cross without an unreasonable forest of towers marching out into the current. But the eastern reach of the bay told an entirely different story, and if you had walked the shoreline on that side instead, you would have understood why. The water there was shallower, more broken by shoals and shifting channels, closer in character to a river crossing than an ocean gap, and that kind of geography called for a different structure altogether, a cantilever built in overlapping arms, reaching out from piers sunk directly into the bay floor, each arm balanced against the next like a hand extended and caught by another hand reaching back. Where the suspension span wanted openness and reach, the cantilever wanted footing, solid points of contact with the ground beneath the water, places where a pier could actually be trusted to stand. Between these two very different demands sat Yerba Buena Island, rising out of the bay almost exactly where the geography changed its mind, and it became, almost by necessity, the seam where the two bridges would have to meet. You can picture it as a knot tying together two ropes of entirely different material. On one side, cable and tower and the long, clean arc of suspension. On the other, steel truss and cantilever arm and pier after pier marching toward Oakland. The island itself would need a tunnel bored straight through its rock so that traffic crossing from one bridge type to the other would pass, for one brief, slow moment, beneath solid stone before emerging onto the second half of the crossing entirely. There is something almost comforting in imagining that tunnel, a dark, quiet interval carved directly into the middle of all that engineering ambition, a place where for a few seconds you would have been surrounded by nothing but rock instead of open water and sky. If you let your mind rest there for a moment, in that dim in-between space, you will have found the exact center point of the entire crossing, the place every calculation on either side was eventually pointed toward. Purcell's engineers did not arrive at this arrangement lightly. Early sketches and proposals had wandered through other possibilities, different landing points, different combinations of span types, arrangements that might have avoided the awkward business of joining two philosophies into a single roadway. But the bay's own shape kept pulling the design back toward this same conclusion, because no clever redrawing of the route could argue away deep water on one side and shallow broken ground on the other. Eventually, the design settled where the geography had been quietly insisting it settle all along, and the question shifted from what to build toward whether anyone could actually be trusted to build it. But could two such different structures, born from two such different engineering traditions, really be trusted to meet as one continuous crossing? And would anyone believe it before it stood there proving itself? This was the doubt that followed the design out of the drafting rooms and into public hearings, into newspaper columns, into the skeptical murmurs of engineers who had spent careers specializing in one form or the other and had never been asked to marry the two. Suspension engineers understood towers and cables and the long, graceful sag of a roadway hung in the air. Cantilever engineers understood piers and trusses and the balanced reach of steel arms extended over shallower water. Very few men understood both traditions deeply enough to feel entirely confident that a single bridge could honor both without some seam of weakness showing exactly where the philosophies met. You would have heard this doubt phrased in different ways depending on who was speaking. A worry about cost from the men who controlled the money, a worry about feasibility from the men who understood steel, and beneath both worries, an older and less articulated unease about whether the bay itself, with its currents and its soft floor and its long history of swallowing whatever careless engineering asked of it, would allow such an ambitious hybrid to stand at all. Newspapers of the era did not let this uncertainty pass quietly. Cost estimates arrived in figures large enough to make legislators blink, and every increase in projected expense brought fresh columns of skepticism, fresh editorials wondering aloud whether the whole undertaking had grown beyond what the state could reasonably justify, fresh voices asking whether a crossing this complicated was worth what it would demand from public coffers already strained by years of harder economic seasons. You can imagine Purcell reading those columns at his own kitchen table, the way any engineer might, absorbing criticism that was not entirely unfair even while knowing that the design in front of him represented the only honest answer the bay's geography had offered. And it was not only the bridge across this bay that carried such weight of public attention and doubt in these years. Just beyond the same stretch of water at the mouth of the bay itself, another crossing was being imagined in parallel, one that would eventually reach for the strait separating the peninsula from the headlands to the north. A bridge that would come to carry its own name and its own particular fame. You do not need to hold the details of that other crossing in your mind tonight. Only the sense of an age hungry to conquer this entire body of water from more than one direction at once. Engineers and politicians and ordinary citizens all catching some shared fever about what could finally be built here after so many decades of ferries and delay and water that had always, until now, simply been crossed the slow way or not crossed at all. That hunger did not make Purcell's task any lighter. If anything, it added a quiet pressure of comparison, a sense that whatever rose across this bay would inevitably be spoken of alongside whatever rose at the strait, and that neither crossing could afford to be the lesser achievement in a city already beginning to imagine itself transformed by both. But comparison was a problem for editorial columns and civic pride, not for the drafting tables, and Purcell's engineers kept their attention fixed on the narrower, harder question in front of them. Whether the joining at Yerba Buena Island could actually be built as calculated, whether the piers beneath the eastern reach could find real footing in a bay floor that no one yet fully trusted, and whether the whole assembly, suspension and cantilever bound together through a tunnel bored into island rock would behave the way the drawings promised once real steel and real cable and real concrete replaced the pencil lines. Somewhere in the middle of all this waiting, The design debates, the cost hearings, the newspaper skepticism stood the men who would eventually have to turn drawings into structure, and among them, though he did not yet have work to put his hands to, was the ironworker foreman you have already met once in this story. He had been drawn toward the bay the way certain men are always drawn toward the next great undertaking, following word of a bridge project the way others might follow word of a gold strike. And for now, there was nothing for him to do but wait, the same as everyone else, for the arguments in Sacramento and San Francisco to settle themselves into an approved design. You can picture him standing at the edge of the water some evenings, looking out at exactly the stretch of bay that would eventually decide by its own depth and its own floor what kind of bridge could be built above it, with no way yet of knowing how many seasons he would spend on scaffolding that did not yet exist, above piers that had not yet been poured, waiting on a design that had not yet been finished. He was, in this waiting, like hundreds of others whose names no record kept, gathered near a bay they could not yet build across, trusting that the men behind the drafting tables would eventually settle their disagreements and hand down a plan solid enough to risk a life upon. That trust would soon be tested against the one obstacle that no design debate, however careful, could argue its way past: the bay floor itself, waiting beneath the water, indifferent to towers and cantilevers alike. And it is to that reckoning, the reckoning with water that would not simply be trusted, that this story now gently turns. What that reckoning would actually require, no one in the drafting rooms could yet say with any certainty, and that uncertainty was its own kind of quiet unease among men who prided themselves on certainty. Soundings had been taken, yes, boats rowed out at odd hours with weighted lines dropped over the side, but a sounding only tells you how far down the water goes, not what waits at the bottom of it, not whether the floor there is rock a pier could grip, or mud that would simply swallow whatever was lowered into it. You could stand at the rail of one of those survey boats, feel the line pay out through your hands, and still know nothing certain about what held the bay together beneath its surface. If you have ever dropped something into dark water and felt the rope go slack without ever quite feeling it land, you already understand the particular helplessness those early engineers carried back to shore with them, evening after evening, no closer to trusting the ground than when they had set out that morning. The men who ran those survey lines were not guessing without reason. By the middle of the work, the United States Army engineers and the state's own bridge crews had strung a grid of soundings across the strait, hundreds of them, each one a small blind appointment kept with the bottom of the bay. You can picture it as a kind of slow, patient embroidery worked from the deck of a boat that never stopped drifting on the tide, every stitch a place where a weight had gone down and a number had come back up. Some of those numbers told a story the engineers wanted to hear, a firm check on the line, a resistance that meant something solid was down there. Others told a story nobody wanted, a soft give that meant the plumb bob had simply kept sinking into mud that had no bottom anyone had yet found. If you were the one holding the reel that day, you would have felt that difference in your hands before anyone said a word about it. The rope suddenly heavier with disappointment. The bay itself made the search harder than it had any right to be. This was not a lake. It was a drowned river valley, carved long before there were engineers or bridges or even people to need them, and then filled by the sea when the ice let go and the water rose around what had once been dry hills. That old shape never went away. It only went under. Somewhere beneath the surface, the original valley walls still leaned down into darkness, and the deepest channel still ran along what had once been a riverbed, scoured for centuries by tides moving in and out through the Golden Gate with a force that never entirely rested. Stand on the shore at the change of the tide, and you can feel that force even now, a kind of held breath in the water just before it turns. Down at the bottom, that same water had spent thousands of years pushing silt back and forth, burying whatever bedrock might have offered a bridge a place to stand, and leaving in its place a bed of soft mud that in places went down far deeper than anyone building on land would ever think to check. It is worth sitting with that mud for a moment because it was not simply an inconvenience to be scraped aside. In parts of the central bay, the soundings kept finding soft ground long after they should have struck something firm, and the deeper the drills went, the more it became clear that a layer of loose sediment sat there like a blanket pulled up over the true floor. thick in places, thin in others, and never predictable from one boring to the next. You could sink a pier 50 feet down and still be resting on nothing more trustworthy than damp clay, no more capable of carrying the weight of a steel tower than the sand at the edge of a beach is capable of holding up a house. Somewhere below that clay, the engineers believed, there was rock. The trouble was that nobody yet knew how far below, and the bay was not a place that gave up such answers easily or all at once. There is nothing you need to hold on to in any of this. It is enough to let the picture settle. Dark water, a drifting boat, a line paying out into a place no lantern could ever quite reach. The tidal current made the whole search feel like trying to read something written on a page that would not stay still. Twice a day, the tide reversed itself, and the water in the strait began moving the other way, and when it moved with a strength that could turn a moored survey boat against its own anchor and drag a sounding line sideways before it ever touched bottom. Divers who went down in those years, and there were a few, sent down in heavy suits with air pumped from above, mostly to check on structures already in progress rather than to feel out virgin ground, came back describing a world with almost no visibility at all, a blackness broken only by the small glow of a hand lamp, and a current strong enough at times to lift a man off the bottom if he lost his footing on the silt. You would have felt that current before you saw anything of it, a steady pressure against your whole body, patient and enormous, as though the bay itself had simply decided you were in its way. That current, more than almost anything else, is why the search for solid footing could not be rushed. Every foot of progress in mapping the bay floor was bought with time, with boats going back out on days when the water allowed it and sitting idle on days when it did not, with soundings repeated because the first pass had been taken during a slack tide and the engineers wanted to know what the same spot looked like when the water was working against it. It is a strange kind of labor to imagine from a warm bed at night, a whole crew of men whose entire job was to keep asking the bay the same question over and over in slightly different words until the answers stopped contradicting each other. So how deep, in the end, would the builders actually have to go to put this doubt to rest, to find something under all that water and all that mud that a bridge could finally be trusted to stand on? The answer, when it came, surprised even people who had expected to be surprised. In the deepest part of the central channel, the piers meant to carry the western half of the crossing would have to be sunk to depths that had no real precedent anywhere in the world for a structure of this kind. Where an ordinary bridge foundation of the era might have gone down perhaps 60 or 80 feet before meeting rock, the surveys here were showing depths that ran on and on, past that mark, past the next one, into territory where the engineers were essentially inventing the scale of the problem as they measured it. One pier, when the final figures were confirmed, would need to reach roughly 240 feet below the surface of the water to find footing firm enough to trust, a depth that made it, at the time, the deepest bridge pier ever attempted anywhere, deeper than any comparable foundation then standing in the world. You do not have to hold that number either. It is enough to know that when the chief engineer looked at what the soundings were telling him, he was looking at a hole in the record books as much as a hole in the bay. Charles H. Purcell, who carried the responsibility for the whole crossing on his shoulders through these years, understood better than almost anyone what that number actually meant in practice. He had come to the project already seasoned by highway and bridge work across the country, a man not given to overstatement, and by every account he treated the depth problem the way he treated most problems, as something to be solved by more information rather than more optimism. Under his direction, the survey work was pushed further than convention required, because convention had nothing useful to say about a channel this deep and a bed this uncertain. It was not enough, in his view, to find rock somewhere beneath the mud. The engineers needed to know what kind of rock, how sound it was, whether it would hold a load evenly or crack unevenly under the strain of a pier settling into it over years of tide and traffic and its own enormous weight. That question is what brought a geologist into a story that had until then belonged mostly to engineers and surveyors. Andrew Lawson, a professor at the University of California across the bay in Berkeley, had already spent much of his career studying the ground beneath the region. He was among those who had mapped the fault line that had shaken the city so badly a few decades before, and his name carried real weight when it came to reading what the earth under San Francisco Bay was actually made of. Brought in to advise on the foundation question, Lawson's work was less about a single dramatic discovery than about patient correlation, matching core samples pulled up from borings against what was already known of the region's older rock, building a picture of where the bay's underlying formations rose close enough to the surface to be reached, and where they sank away into depths that made a pier there simply impractical. It was quiet work, the kind that produces maps and reports rather than headlines. But it gave Purcell and his engineers something they had not had before: a reasoned basis for choosing where the great piers would actually stand, rather than a hope. But knowing, in principle, that rock lay somewhere below is a different thing entirely from proving it under one exact spot in dark water, and that gap between a geologist's map and a driller's certainty is where the truly unglamorous part of this story begins. That gap was closed, foot by foot, by drilling. Long before any construction crew arrived with cranes and cofferdams, exploratory drilling rigs were mounted on barges and towed out to the positions the survey grid had marked as promising. And there they sat, sometimes for days at a stretch, boring narrow test holes down through the mud toward whatever lay beneath. This was not the kind of drilling that produces a dramatic gusher or a visible breakthrough. It produced cores, thin cylinders of whatever material the bit had passed through, pulled up length by length and laid out on the barge deck for examination, mud giving way to firmer clay, clay giving way, if the crew was fortunate, to something that rang differently against a hammer and held its shape when handled. Each core was a small, silent verdict on one single point in the bay, and it told the engineers nothing whatsoever about the point 10 feet away, which might turn out completely differently. If you had stood on one of those drilling barges through a full working day, you would have found very little to watch. The work was mostly waiting for the bit to advance another few feet, waiting for the tide to ease enough to keep the barge steady, waiting for a core to be freed and hauled up so it could be measured, logged, and set aside. The men who ran those rigs were not remembered individually in the record the way the chief engineer was. They belonged instead to that broader category of laborers whose names the paperwork rarely bothered to keep, the crews who did the sounding and the drilling and the endless small adjustments that made the later, more celebrated construction possible at all. One of them, a leadman on a drilling barge, unnamed in the surviving accounts but present in dozens like him across the length of the project, would have spent whole days simply logging depth against time in a notebook, watching the cable feed out, feeling for the change in resistance that meant the bit had finally met something worth stopping for. It was slow, close, careful work, the kind that leaves no monument of its own and asks for none. The results of all that patient boring did not agree with each other in any comforting way. In some places, the rock came relatively near the surface, offering the kind of foundation an engineer could plan around with some confidence. In others, the core samples kept coming back full of clay and silt long after the drill had gone down well past where anyone had hoped to stop. And the crews simply had to keep going, adding pipe, adding time, until either rock finally answered or the position was abandoned as unworkable and the search moved to another point on the grid. Whole potential pier locations were quietly set aside this way, discarded not because the design called for them to be somewhere else, but because the bay itself had refused to offer anything solid at that particular spot. It is easy, lying still and half asleep, to let all of this blur into a single soft impression of men and boats and mud, and that is really all it needs to be. The sense of a great deal of quiet, careful failure absorbed calmly, one boring at a time, until enough good ground had finally been found to build a bridge on. And while all of that patient work went on in open water, there was one piece of solid ground already waiting in the middle of the bay, a small rocky island that the survey crews had good reason to look at very differently from everything around it. Yerba Buena Island sat almost exactly where the crossing needed to pass, a low hump of rock and brush rising out of the water roughly at the midpoint of the strait, and to the engineers planning the route, it looked less like scenery than like an enormous stroke of good fortune. Everything else in this story so far has been about the absence of solid footing, soft mud, uncertain depths, rock that kept refusing to show itself where it was wanted. The island was the opposite of all that. It was solid, straight through, a genuine outcrop of firm material sitting squarely in the path of the bridge, and once the route had been settled, it became clear that the crossing could actually use the island as a kind of built-in foundation, a place where the western half of the bridge, rising from the deep water toward the city, could meet the eastern half, running out across the shallower flats toward the far shore without either half needing to depend on the other for its footing. The problem was that a roadway crossing an island still needs a way through it, and Yerba Buena was not flat. Rather than carry the deck up and over the high ground, the engineers chose to go straight through the rock itself, boring a tunnel that would carry both levels of the roadway beneath the island's summit and out the other side. When it was finished, that bore was the widest tunnel of its kind anywhere in the world, wide enough to carry the full double stack of lanes the bridge would eventually need, cut through rock that, whatever its other virtues, still had to be blasted and mucked out foot by men working in confined, dust-choked conditions with the weight of the island pressing down over their heads. If you had stood at the tunnel face during that work, the first thing to reach you would not have been the sight of the rock at all, but the smell of blasting powder still hanging in the air, and beneath it, the low grind of machinery working in a space too enclosed to ever let the sound entirely escape. That tunnel became, in a very literal sense, the hinge of the whole structure, the single fixed point around which the entire crossing's two very different characters would be organized. To the west, toward San Francisco, the bridge would have to leap the deepest, least trustworthy water in the bay, which called for the great suspension spans and the piers already known to require that record-setting depth. To the east, toward Oakland, the water was shallower, and the crossing could take a different form entirely, one better suited to the flatter mudflats on that side of the strait. Yerba Buena Island, and the tunnel bored through its heart, was where those two very different halves would be stitched into a single continuous roadway, and it is fair to say that nothing else in the entire project offered the engineers such an unambiguous gift of solid ground. Everywhere else, the bay had made them work for every foot of footing. Here, at least, the rock simply was what it appeared to be. It would be pleasant to end this part of the story there, with one clean, dependable answer in the middle of so much uncertainty. But the deep water on either side of that island had not gone anywhere, and the record-setting piers still had to be built on ground that had only been located, not yet proven under load. All the soundings, all the borings, all of Lawson's patient correlation of core samples against the region's older rock had produced a set of educated positions, not guarantees. The final proof would come only when a caisson was actually lowered toward one of those deep points and either settled the way the drawings predicted or did not. Purcell and his engineers, for all the work already done, were still in the position of men who had located a door in the dark, without yet knowing for certain what lay on the other side of it. That is where the waiting settled in. Not dramatic waiting, not the kind that keeps anyone from sleep, but the ordinary, extended patience of engineers who have done everything the available knowledge allows and must now simply let the data catch up with their plans. Reports came back from the drilling barges. Lawson's assessments were checked against fresh cores as they arrived. Purcell reviewed depth figures that kept confirming, again and again, that this pier or that one would have to go down further than any bridge foundation yet built. And beneath all of it sat the same quiet, unresolved fact that had been true since the first sounding line went over the rail. The ground was still the one thing in this entire project that no one had built, no one had chosen, and no one could fully trust until the moment the work finally met it. Whatever came next, the piers, the caissons, the steel rising at last above the water, would have to be built on an answer the bay had not yet fully given. You would have noticed the smell before you noticed anything else. Hot metal and wet stone, carried on a wind that had not yet decided whether it belonged to the bay or the yards themselves. Somewhere beyond the fog that sat over the water most mornings that year, steel was being made ready to travel farther than any bridge steel in the country had traveled before, and none of it yet knew where it was going. It only knew, in the way that raw material can be said to know anything, that it had been ordered in a size and a quantity that made the men filling out the requisitions pause before they signed. This is the part of the story that never gets much attention, and it is the part I find myself returning to most, lying awake with the plans in my head the way some men count sheep. Before a single rivet went into a single plate above the water, an enormous, quiet mobilization had to happen on land, in places that never saw the bay at all and never would. If your eyes are already closing, let them. None of what follows needs to be held onto, only felt, the way you'd feel the weight of a freight car passing under a bridge without ever counting its wheels. The steel for a bridge like this could not simply be ordered off a shelf because there was no shelf built for a bridge like this. The cantilever section alone demanded members whose scale had more in common with the hull of a ship than with anything called a beam in ordinary practice, because a cantilever bridge works by holding its own arms out over open water on nothing but counterweight and tension, balancing itself the way a plank balances on a fulcrum, except this plank had to carry the weight of trains and trucks and the wind pressing sideways against it from the whole width of the Pacific. Every ounce of steel used to counterweight one arm had to be reckoned against the pull of the arm reaching out from the opposite pier, and if you had stood beside the drafting tables where those numbers were worked out, you would have seen men erase the same figure a dozen times before they let it stand. The steel itself came from mills that had never built anything for this bay and would never see it once the last plate had shipped. Pittsburgh sent steel. So did plants in the Midwest, in places where men had spent their whole working lives without ever setting eyes on the Pacific, forging beams for a crossing they would only ever read about in a newspaper, if they read about it at all. You can picture, if you like, the glow of an open hearth furnace somewhere far from any coastline, the shift of men moving around it in the practiced, unhurried way that men move around something that will kill them if they hurry, and none of them thinking of San Francisco, only of the order sheet pinned near the foreman's station and the tonnage it called for. The concrete told a different story because concrete, unlike steel, does not travel well over long distances. It wants to be mixed close to where it will be poured, and so the search for its ingredients turned inward, toward the hills and quarries around the bay itself. Sand and gravel came from pits not far from the crossing. Cement came by rail and by barge from plants that had been built or expanded specifically because a project of this size had suddenly appeared on the books, needing more cement in a single year than some of those plants had produced in 5. The engineers were particular about it in a way that surprised people outside the trade, not just any cement, not just any aggregate, because the piers rising from the bay floor would spend the whole of their working lives half submerged in salt water, and salt water has its own slow, patient way of attacking concrete and steel alike, working through cracks no eye could see, reaching the reinforcing bar inside and beginning quietly the work of rust. That single fact shaped almost every material decision made for this bridge. Corrosion was the enemy that never announced itself, the one that would not show its face for 10 years or 20, long after the ribbon had been cut and the newspapers had moved on to something else. So the specifications called for denser concrete mixes than most contractors of that era were accustomed to pouring, for more cover over the reinforcing steel than seemed, to some of the men swinging the buckets, entirely necessary, and the steel itself above the waterline would eventually need a skin of paint thick enough and reapplied often enough to keep the salt air from doing to the bridge what it did, slowly, to every ungalvanized nail left out on a dock. None of this made for a dramatic order to place. It only made for an expensive one and an early one, decided long before the first pier broke the surface of the bay. But where does a country already buckling under the weight of its own hard times find enough steel and cement to raise 2 bridges out of open water at once, without the whole undertaking collapsing under its own cost before a single caisson has settled? The answer to that question has almost nothing to do with engineering and almost everything to do with the calendar. This was a project laid down in the depths of the Depression, when steel mills across the country were running at a fraction of their capacity, and mills that had laid off half their workforce were desperate for exactly the kind of order this bridge represented, an order too large to be filled quickly, too complex to be filled carelessly, and too important politically as much as structurally to be filled cheaply. When the requisitions went out from the engineers' offices in California, they did not simply purchase steel. They put men back to work in towns that had nothing to do with San Francisco or Oakland or the water between them, towns where the newspapers ran the bridge story on page 4, if they ran it at all, because what mattered locally was not the crossing, but the reopened furnace, the restarted shift, the paychecks that had stopped coming and had now, unexpectedly, started again. You do not have to remember the names of those towns or the tonnage each mill turned out in a given month to feel the shape of what was happening. It is enough to sit with the plain fact of it. A bridge being built on one coast was quietly keeping families fed on the other side of the continent, in places that never saw so much as a photograph of the water it would eventually cross. The cement plants around the bay itself told a smaller, closer version of the same story. Expansions built, additional shifts hired, cement haulers running longer hours than they had in years, all of it drawing its purpose from 2 piers that had not yet risen an inch above the waterline. It was into this atmosphere, desperate mills wanting the work, a public desperate to see it succeed, a budget that could not simply expand to cover every caution an engineer might wish for, that Charles Purcell kept returning to his desk with the specifications spread in front of him, checking tolerances the way another man might check a lock twice before leaving the house. Purcell had been given charge of an engineering effort large enough to employ thousands, and he treated the material specifications with the same seriousness he had brought to the questions of bedrock and current that had occupied him earlier, refusing again and again to relax a margin simply because a supplier found it inconvenient or a contractor found it costly. There were men on the review boards and men in the contracting firms hoping to win the work, who thought Purcell's insistence on wider safety margins than the codes of the day strictly required was closer to caution for its own sake than to necessity. That a bridge built to withstand the loads this one would actually see did not need quite so much steel in its members, quite so much reinforcing in its concrete, quite so many redundant paths for a load to travel if one member failed. Purcell held his ground on this in the quiet, unglamorous way that engineers hold ground, not through argument so much as through simply declining to sign off on anything less. He had watched, by then, enough of what the bay could do to men and to plans, and he was not interested in discovering after the fact that a margin he had approved on paper had turned out, in the water, to be exactly the wrong amount short. It is worth pausing here in the dark on that particular kind of stubbornness, not the loud kind, not the kind that makes a scene, but the kind that simply keeps asking for one more inch of steel than anyone thinks is needed, because the person asking has spent enough nights doing the arithmetic to know what an inch can cost later, multiplied across every member in a structure this size. If you drift for a moment here, that is fine. There is nothing in this particular passage you need to carry forward except the shape of the man doing it. And once the specifications had been fixed and the orders placed and the mills running, how does all of that steel and stone actually find its way to a bay it was never poured near, a bay it had never once touched? The answer moved slowly, and it moved on 2 kinds of vehicles that had almost nothing in common except the cargo they carried. Steel came largely by rail, in long, deliberate trains that crossed half the country at the unhurried pace freight always keeps, each car carrying members too large to load any other way, chained down and blocked so they would not shift against each other on the grades and the curves. If you had stood at a rail crossing somewhere in the middle of that long haul, you would have felt the ground under your feet before you heard anything at all. And then the low, steady sound of it reaching you the way sound reaches you from beneath the floor well before the train itself came into view. Concrete's raw materials moved differently, more locally, more like the ordinary traffic of a working harbour than like a special shipment, barges loaded with sand and gravel making short, repeated trips from nearby pits, cement arriving in bags and later in bulk by rail car from the expanded plants ringing the bay, none of it glamorous, all of it constant, the kind of traffic that becomes part of the background noise of a place within a matter of weeks. Longshoremen and teamsters who had spent years moving ordinary cargo through the port found themselves moving the ingredients of a bridge instead, without the work itself feeling any different under their hands. A sack of cement is a sack of cement, whether it is bound for a warehouse or for a pier that will one day carry 100,000 crossings a day. The site itself, which not long before had been little more than a scatter of survey markers and the memory of sounding lines going over the rail, began now to gather the unmistakable look of a place where something enormous was accumulating. Stockpiles of aggregate rose along the shoreline. Steel members, still raw and unpainted, were laid out in orderly rows waiting for their turn to be lifted, numbered according to drawings that existed nowhere else but in the engineers' offices and in the memory of the foreman who had learned to read them. Barges rode low in the water on their approach and high and empty on their way back out, and if you had walked that shoreline in the evening, past the stacks of lumber and the coiled cable and the smell of tar drifting off the barges, you would have felt, before anyone told you so, that the waiting was nearly over, that the ground had been sounded, the material gathered, and that the bay, which had given up its answers so reluctantly, was finally about to receive the weight of everything that had been decided about it. What you would not have seen, not from the shoreline and not from the barges, was the second, quieter operation running alongside all that gathering, the testing. Every batch of concrete poured for a structure of this kind had to prove itself before it was trusted anywhere near the bay floor, and so laboratories were set up close to the mixing plants, small rooms with none of the drama of the yards outside, where technicians broke sample cylinders under hydraulic presses and wrote the numbers down in ledgers that Purcell's office reviewed as carefully as any drawing. A single cylinder failing to hold its strength could halt a pour that thousands of dollars and dozens of men were waiting on, and it happened often enough that the men on the mixing crews learned to watch the lab technicians' faces the way sailors watch a sky. Steel went through its own quiet trial. Mill certificates arrived with every shipment, promising a certain strength, a certain composition, but promises on paper were not enough for a bridge that would spend its working life absorbing the sideways push of wind and current and the weight of everything crossing it at once. Samples were pulled and tested again on arrival, and where a shipment fell short of what the certificate claimed, it was set aside, rejected, sent back the long way it had come, another delay stacked onto a schedule that had little room left to absorb one. There is no need to hold on to any of that, only to sit with the picture of it. A bridge being built twice before it was built once, first in ledgers and testing rooms, then in steel and stone above the water. By the time the last barge of aggregate had made its short crossing and the last rail car of cement had been unloaded onto the growing stockpiles, the site had stopped looking like a place where something was being gathered and had started looking like a place where something was about to rise. The piers were waiting for exactly that, for the ground beneath the bay, sounded and studied and argued over for so long, to finally take the weight of everything that had been decided about it. The bay did not surrender its floor easily, and Purcell knew that before a single caisson was lowered. Charles Purcell, the chief engineer entrusted with carrying the whole crossing from drawing to daylight, had spent enough nights over soundings and borehole logs to know that the mud beneath the water was not one thing, but many things, layered and uneven, soft in places that looked solid and firm in places that looked treacherous. If you had stood beside him on the deck of the survey barge in those last quiet weeks before construction truly began, you would have seen a man reading numbers the way another man might read weather, searching them for what they were not quite willing to say. The bay bed here was deep, deeper than almost anyone building a bridge had ever been asked to found a pier, and somewhere beneath that water, on ground nobody could see and few could fully trust, the great piers would have to begin their lives. There is no shortcut through a problem like that. There is only the slow, deliberate business of building downward before anything can rise, and it is that quiet, unglamorous work, hidden entirely beneath the surface, that had to come first. The method chosen was the caisson, an old idea dressed in new dimensions, and if you can imagine a bell without a mouth, sealed and reinforced, lowered slowly into water until it kisses the bottom, you have the shape of what floated out into the channel that season. Compressed air was pumped into the chamber to hold back the water, and inside that pressurized dark, men worked at the bay floor with hand tools and machinery, cutting away silt and clay and whatever rock resisted them, while above, on the surface, cranes and barges shifted the spoil away and lowered fresh concrete down through tremmy pipes to fill the space the men had cleared. You would not have seen much of this from the surface. A calm observer on a passing ferry might have noticed only a squat steel shape riding low in the water, ringed with barges, trailing pipe and cable like something feeding on the bottom of the bay. But beneath that ordinary-looking hull, men were laboring in conditions that asked a great deal of the body, pressure pressing at the ears, the strange thickness of compressed air in the lungs, the particular fatigue that comes from work done far from open sky. It is worth resting here a moment because there is nothing you need to hold on to from this part of the story except the shape of it, the patience of it, the way something as delicate as trust in unseen ground had to be earned one caisson at a time. If your eyes have already started to close, that is exactly the right response to have to a chapter about mud and pressure and slow, careful work done mostly in the dark. Purcell inspected what he could, which was not the caisson floor itself, but everything that could be measured and reported from above, the rate of descent, the readings on the pressure gauges, the concrete pours logged and checked against specification, the divers' reports on how the excavation was progressing below. He was not a man who signed off on faith. Where the boring logs disagreed with what a caisson crew reported finding at depth, he wanted to know why, and there are accounts of him delaying work rather than accept an explanation that did not satisfy him. This was, after all, the same engineer who had waited through years of borings and arguments before agreeing where the piers could safely stand at all, and having waited that long, he was not inclined to let anyone rush the last, most dangerous stretch of the work. If you had been a young engineer on his staff in those months, you would have learned quickly that a shrug was not an acceptable answer to a question about what lay 40 or 60 feet beneath a floating steel chamber. Among the men who went down into that pressurized dark was one whose name the record does not preserve, one of the many divers and caisson hands whose signatures never made it into the official histories, though their work is written into every foot of concrete that still holds those piers in place. He, like the others in his trade, would have known the particular silence of being sealed beneath water and stone, the strange, muffled quality of sound down there, the way even a familiar voice could seem to come from very far away. It was work that asked to be done carefully and without hurry, because hurry beneath pressure has a way of turning into something much worse than a delay. You do not need to remember his name because no one recorded it, but you might carry the shape of him a little further into this story because men like him did not stop with the piers. They would surface again and again throughout the building of this bridge, wherever water and steel needed to meet without a mistake between them. By the time each caisson had been filled and capped, and the piers themselves had begun to rise from the surface as solid, squared towers of concrete breaking the plane of the water, the bay had given up what it was going to give up, on the terms the engineers had spent years negotiating for. The ground had held. It is a strange thing to say about mud and silt and buried rock, but it had held, and everything above it now had a foundation to stand on. But a foundation sunk into the floor of a bay is only ever half of a bridge, and what needed to happen next was the part that would finally be visible to anyone standing on a hillside or a passing boat deck, the part where steel began, at last, to climb. The western reach of the crossing, running from the city toward the island that split the bay in two, was to be carried on suspension towers, and if you had watched those towers rise, you would not have seen anything sudden about it. Steel came out to the piers in sections, hoisted by derricks mounted on the structure itself, each length lifted, guided into place, bolted, and then riveted fast before the next length went up. A tower like that does not appear so much as accumulate, and the men who built it worked to a rhythm dictated less by ambition than by season. Steel could be delivered only as fast as the mills and barges could bring it, riveting slowed in cold or wet weather, and the whole climb was paced not in days but in the turning of one season into the next. Stand at the base of one of those towers in early spring, and you might see it rise past the height of anything else on the waterfront by the time autumn came around. And even that would have felt to the men doing the work like remarkable speed. There is a particular sound that belongs to a tower under construction, and if you close your eyes you can imagine it well enough. The ring of steel struck by steel, carried oddly across open water, softened by fog until it seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Riveting gangs worked in small practice teams, one man heating rivets in a portable forge, another catching the glowing metal in tongs and passing it to a third who drove it home with a pneumatic hammer, while a fourth held a heavy bar against the opposite side to back the blow. It was loud, repetitive, exacting work, done at heights that would have made an ordinary visitor's knees go soft, and it went on for as long as daylight and weather allowed. But steel towers rising straight out of piers were only one half of what the bay demanded, because the eastern reach of the crossing, running from the island onward toward the shore where the land rose up on the other side, called for a different kind of engineering altogether. There, the plan called for cantilever construction, an approach that does not simply stack steel upward, but reaches it outward, span by span, over open water, with each arm balanced against a counterweight on the opposite side, so that the whole structure holds itself steady even before it meets anything on the far end. If a suspension tower is a patient climb, a cantilever arm is something closer to a held breath. Steel reached outward over the channel a length at a time, tied back to its anchor pier by weight and geometry rather than by any support beneath it, and for months at a stretch, the arms of that structure simply hung there over open water, finished at one end and pointing at nothing at the other, waiting for the day when two such reaches, extended from opposite piers, would finally be close enough to be joined. If you had taken a boat out into the channel in those years and looked up, you would have seen something that does not have an easy name, a skeleton of steel stretching out over water with no roadway beneath it, no rail yet laid, nothing carried across it at all, and yet unmistakably a bridge already, in shape if not yet in purpose. It must have been one of the strangest sights on that waterfront, stranger in its way than the finished crossing would ever be. Half of something enormous, reaching toward the other half of itself, held up by nothing more than careful arithmetic and the steel already in place behind it. That much steel does not lift itself, though, and behind every foot of that skeletal reach stood machinery and men working at a scale that is easy to describe in figures and much harder to describe in any way that does the work. Justice. So what exactly did it take to keep steel climbing like that week after week over open water without the whole enterprise slowing to a crawl or grinding to a halt? It took, first of all, machines built for nothing else but this. Traveling derricks mounted directly on the rising steel crept forward as the work progressed, lifting each new section into place from barges moored below, themselves guided by cables and counterweights and the practiced hand of an operator who had learned through repetition exactly how much play to allow before a swinging length of steel became a hazard rather than a delivery. Compressed air lines ran the length of the working platforms to feed the riveting hammers. Temporary scaffolding, itself built from steel and timber, threaded through the permanent structure like a second disposable bridge built only to help raise the first. Walkways with no railing worth trusting, ladders lashed rather than bolted, platforms that existed for a season and were struck down and rebuilt somewhere else the moment their purpose was served. If you had walked those temporary decks yourself, you would have felt them give slightly underfoot, not from any flaw, but simply because that is what temporary steel does. And you would have understood without being told that every step out there was a small, repeated act of trust in men you had likely never met. The foreman who directed the riveting crews on the rising towers, one of many such men across the length of the crossing, though the record gives us only glimpses of any one of them by name, worked from a set of habits that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with sound. He could tell by the ring of a hammer against a rivet whether the joint had been driven properly or needed to be cut out and redone, and crews that worked under a foreman like that learned quickly that there was no fooling him by working fast and driving sloppy. Wages for riveters and their gangs were higher than for most other trades on the crossing, and for good reason. The work demanded a coordination between four men that had to be nearly wordless, since no one could hear a shouted instruction over the hammering anyway, so signals were given by hand, by rhythm, by long practice together on other steel, on other bridges, in other cities, before this one had ever called them west. There is nothing wrong with letting some of this blur a little as you listen, the ring of hammers and the creak of temporary decking folding together into one long, steady sound, because that is closer to how it would have felt to actually be there than any careful list of machinery ever could. You do not need to hold on to the names of the derricks or the specifications of the rivets. What matters is the picture of it, steel reaching out over water in both directions at once, from towers that had climbed a season at a time, and from cantilever arms extended one careful length after another, all of it still short of meeting, all of it still, for the moment, two unfinished halves of the same idea. And it is that unfinished quality more than anything else that stays with you if you picture the bay in those years, a crossing you could see from either shore, unmistakably a bridge in its bones, and yet still divided down the middle by open water, waiting for the day when the reach from one side would finally close the gap left by the reach from the other, and the two halves that had risen so separately out of so much caisson work and steel and patient climbing would at last have to become one continuous thing. That waiting had its own arithmetic. One Purcell tracked as closely as he had once tracked pressure gauges on the caissons. Surveyors on both piers took sightings almost daily as the arms crept closer, checking that months of independent work, riveted a continent away from any shared reference point, still agreed with the drawings down to a fraction most people would never notice by eye. A gap that had once measured the width of a channel now measured less than the length of a barge, and somewhere in that shrinking distance lay the whole question of whether two bridges built apart could ever truly become one. You would not have heard the riveting gun before you felt it. That was the thing almost every account from those years agrees on. The vibration reaching up through your boot soles before the sound ever caught up with your ears. A fast, stuttering knock carried along steel that had nowhere else to go but into you. Stand on a lower chord of the bridge on an ordinary working morning, sometime in the long stretch when the towers had risen and the cantilever arms were still reaching for one another over open water, and that is what would have found you first. Not the view, though the view was there too, the whole bay laid out grey and moving beneath your feet. Not the cold, though the cold found everyone eventually. The knock of the gun, steady as a heartbeat that did not belong to you. It helps to remember that a bridge this size was not built by a crew in the way a house is built by a crew. It was built by several thousand men doing several dozen different trades, most of whom never spoke to most of the others, each trade moving along the steel at its own pace and leaving behind work for the next trade to inherit. Iron came up from the barges and went first to the riveting gangs, 4 men to a gang as a rule, the heater who kept a small coke forge glowing and pitched rivets red-hot through the air to be caught in a metal cone or an old bucket, the catcher who caught them, the bucker-up who held a heavy iron dolly against the head of the rivet from one side, and the man with the gun who drove the other head home from the far side of the plate before the metal could cool and lose its grip. You would have watched a rivet arc through the air, glowing 20 or 30 feet, caught clean, and you would have understood in that one motion why the whole operation depended on trust between 4 men who might never learn each other's full names. Wages for that kind of work sat well above what a laborer on the ground could expect, and everyone on the steel understood why. Riveters and other high-scale iron workers on major steel jobs of that era were commonly paid something in the neighborhood of $1 an hour when good ground labor was earning a third or a quarter of that, and men came from bridge jobs and shipyards up and down the coast once the word went out that San Francisco Bay had work like this to offer. A 10-hour day was not unusual in the earlier stretches of the job, tightening later toward 8 as labor rules shifted under the New Deal years, and the shifts followed the light and the tide rather than any tidy schedule. Crews working the caissons below sometimes on hours that had nothing to do with sunrise at all, since compressed air work below the bay floor cared only about pressure and time, not daylight. Meals came up with the men, mostly, carried in pails or paper, eaten wherever a plank was wide enough to sit on and a fitting was not currently swinging past. There was no canteen suspended in the sky. A man ate his lunch with his legs hanging over open water because that was where lunchtime found him. And the accounts that survive describe a peculiar, companionable quiet in those breaks. Gangs from different trades nodding to each other across a gap of steel, sharing a thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm 2 hours before, saying little because the gun would start again soon enough, and there would be no point starting a conversation you could not finish. If your eyes are already growing heavy, there is nothing you need to hold on to in any of this. Only the picture of it, men eating quietly above the water, letting that quiet settle over you the way it settled over them. But what was it actually like, day after day, to do this kind of work at this kind of height, with the bay always moving beneath you and the fog coming and going without much warning? The height was the first thing every new man had to make some kind of peace with, and the record suggests most of them did, faster than you might expect. Fear at elevation is not something the body keeps at full strength for months on end. It dulls, the way any constant sensation dulls, until a man could walk a 6-inch flange with a coil of cable over one shoulder and think mostly about the cable. That dulling was itself a danger the foreman watched for, because a man too comfortable with the height was a man who had stopped being careful about it. Fog was the other constant, rolling through the towers some mornings thick enough that a crew 40 feet along the same span might as well have been on a different job entirely, unseen, only heard. The knock of a distant gun, a shout passed hand to hand rather than called across open air, because open air swallowed a voice out there and gave nothing back. You would have learned quickly which sounds meant nothing and which sounds meant get clear, and there would have been no time to think it through, only to move. Cold on the water was its own separate weather from cold on the land, sharper, wetter, carried on wind that had nothing to slow it down for miles. Gloves wore through in weeks. Men layered whatever they had, and photographs from the job show heavy coats and knit caps under hard hats that were still, in those years, a fairly new requirement rather than an old habit. One of a run of safety measures that the job's leadership, including the chief engineer whose name has already crossed this story more than once, pushed for harder than many contractors of the period were used to. Charles Purcell, the same man who had once tracked the air pressure in the caissons the way another man might track his own pulse, is on record as having taken safety on the crossing personally rather than treating it as a cost to be managed, and one of the clearest results of that attitude was strung beneath the work before very long, and it is to that net and to what it caught that the story turns next. What happened then, when the work itself went wrong at that height, with nothing beneath a man but cold moving water and a very great distance to fall? The net is the part of this story that people who read about the bridge afterward tend to remember most clearly, and it deserves the attention, because it was not a small or a symbolic thing. A manila rope net, some 40 feet wide, was strung the length of the working span beneath the ironworkers, moved along as the crews advanced, and it is credited in the record with saving a number of men. The figure most commonly cited sits close to 24 Sikh who would otherwise have gone straight into the bay from a considerable height, with very little chance of surfacing again in cold water, wearing heavy boots and a coat soaked through in the first second of the fall. You would have known the net was there without needing to look down and check, the way you know a floor is solid under a rug. It changed how a crew moved, made a man willing to reach a fraction further for a beam he might otherwise have let go rather than risk. Some of the men caught by it walked away with nothing worse than a fright and a story they told for the rest of their working lives. It is worth resting on that for a moment before the story moves anywhere else. An idea hung in rope beneath heavy iron, doing exactly the quiet, unglamorous work it was designed to do. Not every danger came from a fall in the open air, though. Riveting itself carried its own smaller, constant risks. A hot rivet mishandled, a spark landing wrong, a gun kicking back against a wrist that had done 10,000 rivets already that week and had nothing left in reserve for the 10,001st. The bucker-up, standing opposite the gun, took the worst of the vibration through his arms and shoulders over a full shift. And it was recognized even then as work that wore a body down faster than most, which is part of why the pay sat where it did. Foremen on a job like this carried the weight of watching for all of it at once. The fog, the fatigue, the gun kicking wrong, the net sagging under a load it had not been checked for that morning, and the foreman is remembered in the accounts less as any single man than as a type, a figure who appears in every gang's memory of the job wearing a slightly different face but doing the same rounds. One habit turns up again and again in the oral histories collected from ironworkers of that generation on jobs very much like this one. The foreman walking the steel before the first gang arrived, not because there was anything specific to check that morning, but because he wanted his own boots on every plank before he sent anyone else's boots onto it. It cost him nothing, and it told a crew everything they needed to know about who they were working for. There is no single foreman's name attached to that habit here, because none of the surviving records give this bridge's foreman individually to us in that kind of detail. They come down through history as a class of men rather than as persons, the way most of the several thousand who built this crossing come down to us. And it is worth letting that sit quietly with you rather than reaching for a name that was never recorded. The deaths that did occur on the job are recorded with more precision than almost anything else about the ordinary working day, because a death was a thing that had to be reported, investigated, entered into a ledger somewhere, whether or not a name survived alongside it in the newspapers. Estimates for the total lost across the whole span of construction, towers, caissons, cantilevers, the long approach work on either shore run to a small number for a project of this size, a fact the era's own engineers took some quiet pride in without ever treating it as anything to celebrate, since a small number is still built from individual mornings that ended in a way nobody expected when the shift began. The net gets much of the credit for keeping that number as low as it was. Compressed air sickness beneath the bay claimed lives in the tunnel and caisson work in a way no net could have prevented, since that danger lived inside a man's blood rather than in open air, and the story of the caissons has already told you what could be done and what could not be done about that. What matters here, in the part of the story that belongs to the men on the steel rather than the men below the mud, is that the falls that did happen happened to real people whose gangs went quiet for the rest of that shift and no longer, because the work did not wait, could not wait, and the next man's rivet still needed to go in hot. But who were all these men, really, in the hours the job did not own, once the whistle went and the gun fell silent and the ferry or the truck carried them back toward whatever room or boarding house was waiting? They were overwhelmingly men a long way from settled lives. Bridge and structural steel work in that period drew heavily on a traveling trade. Iron workers who followed the big jobs up and down the coast the way other men followed the harvest, carrying their tools and their trade papers from one skyline to the next, taking rooms by the week near whatever yard or dock was closest to the current job. Some had come from shipyards, some from other bridges entirely, a few from mining and heavy construction work inland where the muscle and the nerve required were not so different even if the tools were. For the length of this job they became, briefly and completely, a single working population bound to one another by nothing more than the shared task of getting this particular structure across this particular stretch of water, and then, when their trade's part of the work was finished on a given span, they scattered again to the next job somewhere else, the way a crew like this always has and still does. If you are drifting now, let that image carry you rather than pull you back. A great temporary town of workers gathered for a few years around one task, dispersing without much ceremony once the task was done. Very few of their names survive in any record a person could search today, and that absence is not a failure of history so much as an honest reflection of how the job itself was recorded at the time. Payrolls kept for accounting, not for memory, injury reports filed for insurance, not for posterity. What survives instead is the shape of the work itself, the routine of the gangs, the sound of the gun, the net doing its patient job beneath the iron, the foreman walking the plank before anyone else's boots touched it. Purcell's name endures because an engineer of his standing left behind reports, letters, testimony before boards and commissions, the paper trail that any chief engineer generates almost without meaning to. The riveters and catchers and heaters and bucker-ups who did the actual work of closing this bridge, span by span, gang by gang, mostly did not leave that kind of trail. And the honest thing to do, telling their story now, is to say so plainly, rather than to invent names for men who earned better than invention. They are remembered, if they are remembered at all, the way this whole crossing remembers most of the people who built it, as a great collective effort rather than a roll call. Thousands of ordinary hours added together into something that would outlast every one of the hands that shaped it. And it was those hands, still working through fog and cold and the steady knock of the gun, that were closing the last of the distance between the two halves of the bridge, even as all of this was happening around them. The same narrowing gap the surveyors had been tracking, now measured not in engineering abstractions but in the very human terms of which gang would be the one standing on the steel when the two sides of the crossing finally, after all these seasons of separate work, became one continuous structure across the water. The gap itself, by the time the gangs on the east crossing could see it plainly, was no longer the vast reach of open water it had been when the piers first broke the surface of the bay. It had narrowed to something you could have thrown a stone across had anyone been foolish enough to try, and every crew working that stretch of steel understood exactly what they were closing. But how do you join two bridges that were never meant to behave the same way, that were drawn on different sheets by different logic, and ask them to carry one continuous roadway as though they had always been a single structure? That question sat at the center of everything happening now at Yerba Buena Island, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before the two halves finally touch. West of the island, the roadway hung from cable, carried in long suspended curves between towers that let the deck sway and breathe with the wind and the traffic upon it, the whole system built to move a little, to give, to answer load with flex rather than rigidity. East of the island, the roadway sat on a cantilever and truss structure that behaved almost like a beam supported at intervals, stiff where the suspension section was supple, resisting deflection where the other half of the crossing was designed to accept it gracefully. You could stand at the boundary between the two, if you had been allowed onto the unfinished decking that autumn, and feel the difference in your own body before anyone explained it to you, one side underfoot with a faint, living give to it, the other planted and still. Two different bridges, in the truest engineering sense, were being asked to meet at Yerba Buena Island and continue as if they were one. The island itself did the joining. Rather than trying to marry a suspension anchorage directly to a cantilever's rigid framing out over open water, the design ran both crossings into solid rock, boring a tunnel through the island itself so that the transition between the two systems could happen on ground that did not move, where cable tension and truss stiffness both had something unyielding to answer to. It was, in its way, an elegant solution to an unglamorous problem. You do not ask two different kinds of bridge to agree with each other in mid-air if you can instead give them both a mountain to lean on. The bore through the island had been driven wide enough that 4 decks of roadway and rail could eventually pass through it side by side, and if you had walked into that opening while the work was still underway, the sound alone would have told you what it was. Compressed air hammering somewhere ahead in the dark, the smell of blasted rock still hanging in the tunnel air, water finding its way down the drilled walls in thin black lines that caught what little light there was. Charles Purcell had staked a great deal of his professional reputation on the idea that these two structural systems, so different in their instincts, could be brought together without compromise to either. He had approved a design that used the suspension span where the water demanded flexibility and the cantilever where the ground beneath Yerba Buena Island and the shallower reaches toward Oakland could bear a stiffer, more economical structure, and he had done so knowing that the seam between them, right at the island, would be the place where every doubt about the decision would eventually be tested. If the two halves did not align, if the roadway grades did not match, if the expected movement of the suspended deck under load pulled its end of the roadway out of true with the fixed cantilever section beside it, the mismatch would not stay hidden in a drawer of calculations. It would be there under the wheels of every car that ever crossed, a bump or a shudder repeated for as long as the bridge stood. You do not need to carry any of these distinctions with you tonight, the suspension logic or the truss logic or which pier answered to which. It is enough to know that two very different kinds of strength were being asked to meet at a single point, and that the island had been chosen quietly and sensibly as the place where that meeting could happen without asking either half of the bridge to pretend to be something it was not. What it actually took to make the two halves agree, though, once they were physically close enough to touch, is where the real story sits. And it is a story of patience rather than power, of small adjustments made again and again until a gap measured in feet became a gap measured in inches, and then in the width of a hand, and then in nothing at all. Survey crews had been tracking the closing distance for months by the time the final sections were ready to be set, taking sightings from fixed points on the island and out along the completed steel, checking and rechecking the alignment the way you might check a level a dozen times on a shelf that only needs to be right once, but had better not be wrong. The tolerance they were working toward was not generous. A structure of this length built outward from opposite shores and around a fixed island in the middle does not simply arrive at a perfect meeting point by accident. Every span that had gone up before this one, every rivet driven and every truss member fitted, carried some faint accumulation of error with it, and the surveyor's work in these final weeks was to find out exactly how much of that error had gathered and where before the last connecting pieces were fabricated to close it. You would have seen, if you had been allowed up onto the unfinished decking near the island in those weeks, small parties of men standing very still for long minutes at a time, one with an instrument braced against a tripod, another out along the steel holding a rod or a target, neither moving, both waiting for a reading to settle. It is not dramatic work to watch. There is none of the noise or urgency you might expect from a story about closing a bridge, no shouted countdowns, no crowd holding its breath. It is quiet, careful, almost domestic in its rhythms, the kind of labor that asks for stillness rather than strength. And yet the whole safety of the joining depended on it, because the men who would eventually drive the final rivets needed to know, to a fraction most people never think to measure in their daily lives, exactly how the pieces in front of them were going to meet. Once the surveys confirmed how much adjustment was needed, the closing members themselves, the last sections of steel that would actually bridge the remaining gap, were fabricated to account for it, some cut slightly differently than the original drawings had called for, built not to an ideal bridge but to the actual bridge that stood there, with all its small inherited imperfections folded into the final measurements. This is a detail worth resting on for a moment, because it says something true about every large structure ever built. The drawings describe an intention, but the closing pieces are always made to fit reality. No two piers rise in perfect agreement with the blueprint. No two spans, built months apart by different gangs under different weather, arrive at exactly the plan's promise. Somewhere near the end, someone has to measure what has actually happened and shape the last pieces to match it, and that quiet correction is as much a part of the bridge's true history as anything drawn in an office. The foreman, whose crews had been driving rivets across the eastern crossing all through that stretch of the work, was, by the time the closing members arrived on site, deep into the particular rhythm that comes at the end of a long structural push, the sense that the work has stopped being about any one span and has become entirely about this last narrow gap, this handful of connections that would decide whether the seasons of separate labor amounted to one bridge or two unfinished ones facing each other across open water. His gangs had already driven more rivets than most of them could have counted, moving from span to span as the steel rose beneath them. And now the same routines that had carried them across the whole eastern crossing were being asked to perform one final time, at closer tolerances than almost anything that had come before. If your eyes have already drifted shut somewhere in the last few minutes, that is exactly the right place for them to be. None of this needs holding onto, and the bridge will still be there, quietly closing its own last gap, whether you are awake for the details or not. The riveting gangs worked the final connections the same way they had worked every connection before them, heater passing a glowing rivet to catcher, catcher passing it to the man holding it in place, the gun driving it home with the same flat percussion that had been sounding across the bay for seasons by then, except that here, at the closing point, every one of those rivets was understood by the men driving it to be part of the joint that made the whole crossing continuous. There is no record of the work slowing out of ceremony or of anyone pausing to mark the moment with anything more than the ordinary attention such work always demanded. The bridge became one structure, not in a single dramatic instant, but across a run of ordinary shifts, rivet by rivet, the gap simply ceasing to exist a little more with each one, until at some point, recorded in the schedules more than in memory, there was no gap left to close. Once the steel stood joined, though, the question the whole crossing had been quietly working toward for years was still unanswered. Would it actually carry what it had been built to carry? A completed structure and a proven one are not the same thing, and no amount of careful surveying or patient riveting could substitute for simply putting weight on the bridge and watching, with instruments and with eyes, exactly what it did in response. But what does it actually take to convince an engineer that a finished bridge will do what its drawings promised? Not celebration and not faith, measurement, applied slowly and repeated until the numbers stopped surprising anyone. The first loads placed on the finished roadway were not automobiles full of dignitaries or crowds eager to be the first across. They were plain, heavy things, construction vehicles and loaded trucks, moved into position according to a careful plan, parked and driven across specific spans, while engineers stationed at piers and at mid-span points read instruments recording exactly how much the structure deflected under the weight and exactly how it recovered once the weight had passed. You would have found none of the drama that popular memory tends to attach to a bridge's first test. What you would have found instead were men with clipboards standing very still near cable anchorages and truss joints, calling out readings to be written down, comparing what actually happened under load against what the calculations all those years earlier in the drafting rooms had said should happen. This was measured, deliberate work, entirely without spectacle, and it suited the temperament of engineers like Purcell far better than any ribbon or ceremony would have. A bridge does not announce its own soundness. It has to be asked, patiently and repeatedly, under conditions that grow gradually closer to the real demands it will face for the rest of its working life: wind, temperature, the shifting live load of traffic that never holds still the way a parked truck does. Every reading taken in those test weeks was another small piece of evidence, and taken together, span by span, they built toward the same quiet conclusion the surveyor's work had been building toward for months before it: that the two different kinds of bridge, joined at the island, were behaving as one continuous structure, carrying and releasing load in patterns close enough to what the drawings had predicted that there was no longer any serious question left to test. It is easy, telling the story now, to rush past this stretch of the work toward the excitement of an opening day, but the men actually responsible for the crossing did not experience it that way, and it would be a disservice to their patience to hurry through it here either. There is nothing you need to carry forward from this part of the story except the shape of the caution itself, that a structure this large was not simply declared finished and thrown open, but tested, watched, and tested again, in exactly the unglamorous manner that keeps bridges standing long after the people who built them are gone. By the time those tests were complete, and the readings had settled into the range the engineers had hoped to see, the crossing that had occupied years of separate labor on both sides of the bay was, in every sense that mattered to the people who had built it, a finished bridge. What remained was not engineering at all, but the entirely different business of telling a public that had watched the piers rise and the steel climb for years that the thing was, at last, ready to be driven across. The city on either shore had followed the work in its own way the entire time, through newspaper photographs of the rising towers, through arguments in print about whether the bridge would ever justify its cost, through the ordinary curiosity of people who had watched something enormous grow slowly across water they had only ever crossed by boat before. When word went out that a date had finally been set for the crossing to open, the response was not restrained. Crowds began making plans for the day the bridge would take its first ordinary traffic, and the newspapers that had spent years reporting each stage of construction, the piers, the delays, the cost, the doubts, now turned their attention to what the finished structure actually meant for a region that had waited so long to stop depending on ferries. The opening itself, when it came, drew the kind of attention that a structure of this scale, closing a gap this significant, could hardly have avoided. Cars queued long before the appointed hour. People walked out onto the roadway on foot in the days set aside for that purpose, looking up at towers and cables and truss members they had only ever seen from a distance, feeling for themselves the particular size of a structure that photographs had never quite managed to convey. The press treated it as exactly the milestone it was. Proof that a crossing many had once doubted could ever be built now stood finished, and more than that, already carrying traffic across water that had defined the boundary of ordinary daily life on both shores for as long as anyone could remember. None of that reception, though, is really the end of this story. A bridge opened to applause is still, on the morning after the applause fades, only beginning the part of its life that matters most. The decades of ordinary crossings it will carry long after the crowds have gone home and the newspapers have moved on to something else, and it is there, in that quieter and much longer stretch of its history, that the next part of this story properly begins. You are still standing, in your mind, where the last section left you, on a deck that a few months earlier had been nothing but open trusswork and swinging cable, and now carries paint and lane markings and the ordinary weight of the world. It is worth staying there a moment longer, because a finished bridge is a different thing to look at than a bridge under construction. And this one, once the false work came down and the scaffolds were struck and hauled away, turned out to be built in two layers stacked one above the other, like two separate roads that had agreed to travel the same route without ever touching. If you had climbed to the upper deck on the morning it opened, you would have found yourself among 6 lanes of automobile traffic, 3 lanes running each way, with nothing above your head but sky and cable and the tops of the towers sliding past. This was the deck built for private cars, for the ordinary Sunday driver and the salesman with a case in the back seat, and it sat high enough above the water that on a clear day you could see the whole curve of the bay opening out on either side of you, the hills of the East Bay behind you shrinking, the towers of the city ahead growing larger with every turn of the wheel. Below your feet, unseen from where you sat, ran a second deck entirely, closed in by the same steel that carried the road above it, and that lower level was not built for cars at all. It carried trucks and buses, and down the center of it, 3 tracks of interurban electric railway, the trains of the Key System and the Southern Pacific running side by side with the heavier road traffic, each in its own lane, each kept apart from the other by nothing more than paint and habit and the good sense of the drivers. You do not need to hold on to the exact count of those lanes, or the tonnage the lower deck was built to carry, to understand the shape of the idea. The engineers had built, in effect, 2 bridges wearing one another's clothes, a private one on top for the automobile age that was still arriving, and a public one below for the age of streetcars and freight that had not yet finished leaving. Charles Purcell, the chief engineer whose name you have already heard more than once in this telling, had argued for that arrangement almost from the earliest drawings, on the plain grounds that a crossing meant to serve a whole region for the rest of the century could not afford to serve only the people who owned cars. It is a decision that reads, from this distance, as almost obvious, and it is worth remembering that obvious decisions are usually the ones that took the longest arguing to arrive at. The bridge that finally stood there in the bay was the physical answer to that argument, worked out in steel and concrete rather than in memoranda, and if you walk it in your mind from one end to the other, West Pier to East Anchorage, you are walking through a compromise that somebody had to fight for. The scale of the thing, once it stood complete and empty of scaffolding, is easiest to feel from underneath. Looking up, the way the diver who had spent so many hours in the cold, dark water around the piers might have looked up if he had ever surfaced directly beneath the finished span. From below, the roadway was no longer a drawing or a set of numbers on a drafting table. It was simply enormous, a lid pulled across the sky, supported on towers that from the water's surface looked less like buildings than like the legs of something that had waded out into the bay and stopped there, mid-stride, and been asked to hold still forever. The suspension towers on the western half rose to a height that put them, for a short while, among the tallest structures built by human hands anywhere on the American coast, taller than most of what stood on the shore behind them, and the cable that ran between them and down into the twin spans was thick enough that a man could not close both hands around it. None of that needs to stay with you in precise figures. What matters, if anything about this needs to matter to you at all tonight, is only the feeling of it. The sense of scale that comes from standing under something built by people and realizing it was built to a size that has almost nothing to do with the size of a person. But what did it actually feel like that first morning to drive across it rather than simply to look at it from below or beside? The people who crossed it in its earliest days, and there were a great many of them almost at once, tended to describe the same handful of impressions, which is itself a kind of evidence, since a crowd rarely agrees so closely about an experience unless the experience really was that consistent. The first impression, almost everyone said, was the sound changing under the tires, the particular hum of a suspension deck, slightly different from ordinary pavement, a hum that seemed to come up through the wheels rather than down from the engine. The second impression was the water. On the older ferries, the bay had always been something you looked out at from the side, low down, close to its surface, smelling the salt and the diesel of the boat itself. From the upper deck of the new bridge, you were suddenly high above it, looking almost straight down in places, and the bay opened out beneath you in a way it had never done for a ferry passenger, wide and grey-green and busy with the last of the boats that the bridge itself was quietly making obsolete. If you had been sitting in the passenger seat that first week, you would have felt the car climb gently as it approached the towers, and you would have felt, too, the strange lightness of crossing above open water with nothing beneath the car but steel and cable, and somewhere far below the bay floor the divers had spent so long fighting to reach. There is nothing you need to remember about that sensation beyond the shape of it, the mild vertigo of trusting a road that has been hung rather than laid, the sense that the whole deck was breathing slightly under the weight of the traffic, rising and falling by fractions of an inch that no passenger could measure, but that every passenger, in some quiet, unspoken way, could feel. Engineers had designed for exactly that flexibility. A bridge this long, hung this high, was never meant to be rigid, and the gentle give in the roadway was not a flaw revealing itself, but a sign that the calculations had been correct. Among engineers of the period, and for a good while afterward, the bridge held a particular kind of respect that had less to do with its beauty, which was not really its selling point, and more to do with the sheer list of records it had briefly claimed. The suspension spans on its western half were, for a time, considered among the most ambitious ever attempted, not because either span alone was the longest in the world, but because of the unusual decision to build two suspension bridges end to end, sharing a single vast concrete anchorage sunk into the bay between them, a piece of engineering so large that some at the time called it the biggest concrete structure ever poured for any purpose. Then there was the matter of the piers themselves, and here the divers' old work under the water comes back into the story, because one of the piers on the western crossing had been sunk to a depth beneath the surface of the bay that made it, according to the engineers' own published accounts, the deepest bridge pier that had ever been placed anywhere in the world up to that time. You do not need to carry that number to bed with you. It is enough to know that somewhere beneath the calm hum of the tires, further down than almost any bridge foundation had ever gone before, sat a piece of concrete that had cost more in nerve and patience than in almost anything else, and that the bridge above it had no idea, and needed no idea, of what it was standing on. And what became, once all of that was finished, of the men whose whole working lives had been bent around getting it built? The answer is a quieter one than the records and the record spans, and it is really the proper end of this part of the story. Purcell himself did not vanish from the bridge the moment it opened. He had staked a career on it, had argued its design through boards and committees and skeptical newspapers, and when it was finally open to traffic, he was, by every account that survives, a man who had earned the right to stand somewhere near the middle of it and simply watch the cars go by. He would go on, in the years afterward, to other work, other roads and bridges across the state and the country. But it is fair to say that nothing he built later carried quite the same weight, in the plain sense of that word, as the crossing he had spent years defending on paper before a single pier went into the water. His legacy, if that is not too grand a word for a man who mostly preferred to let the structure speak for him, was simply this: a crossing built to serve everyone who needed to cross, cars and trucks and streetcar passengers alike, built where skeptics had said it could not be built, holding the shape he had insisted on holding even when it would have been easier and cheaper to build something smaller. The foreman who had walked the high steel every morning checking on the riveting gangs did not linger the way Purcell did. His job, and the job of every foreman like him on that crossing, ended the moment the last connection was tightened and the last scaffold came down. There is nothing dramatic to report about what happened to men like him. No ceremony, no record of a name in the newspapers. The riveting gangs simply broke up, the way work gangs always have. Some men moving on to the next structure, going up somewhere else along the coast. Some going home for good, their tools packed away, their hands slowly losing the particular calluses that came from a life spent gripping hot steel. If you have ever watched a construction site empty out after the last inspection, you will know the feeling. Not a sudden departure, but a slow thinning, crew by crew, until one morning the site that had been full of noise and shouted signals for years is simply quiet, and the only people left are the ones checking gauges and signing forms. That quiet, more than any parade, is probably the truest ending this particular chapter of the story has to offer. If your eyes have already drifted shut somewhere in the middle of all this, that is exactly the right place for them to be, because what is left to say here is small and settled rather than urgent. What stood in the bay after that thinning out was no longer in any sense a construction site. It had become, almost overnight, something far more ordinary and far more permanent. A road in 2 layers, waiting for the daily traffic of a whole region to start treating it the way people treat any road they use often enough, which is to say, without much thought at all. The engineers who had spent years worrying over every rivet and every foot of depth beneath every pier could finally, for the first time, stop watching it as a problem to be solved and start watching it as a thing that simply worked, morning after morning, car after car, the way a bridge is supposed to. That transition from construction site to working structure, from a place full of gangs and foremen and diving crews to a place full of nothing more dramatic than commuters and delivery trucks, is where this chapter closes. And it is exactly where the next one has to begin, because a bridge that has stopped being built has only just started being lived with, and it is that long, unremarkable, decades-deep life of ordinary crossings that the story turns to next. There is one more figure worth placing in this thinning out, and she belonged not to the construction gangs, but to the toll plaza that had been built at the eastern approach, a low structure of booths where, from the very first morning, a shift of toll collectors sat taking coins from drivers who had never done this before and did not always know which pocket to reach into. One of hundreds whose names no record kept, she had been hired away from a department store to work the plaza in its opening weeks, and what survives of her time there is only the general shape of the job, repeated by every collector like her up and down the line. The small window sliding open, the coin passed across, the brief exchange of words with a driver who was, more often than not, crossing the bridge for the very first time and wanted to say so to somebody. That kind of work has no drama in it, and it left no separate legacy of its own, but it is worth remembering that a bridge this size did not simply carry cars, it also employed a whole small population of people whose job was to stand still while the bridge moved past them, one vehicle at a time, for the rest of their working lives. Meanwhile, the ferries that the bridge was quietly replacing had not stopped running yet, not all at once. And for a while, captains who had spent decades reading the tides of the bay found themselves working boats that carried fewer and fewer passengers each month, watching from the wheelhouse as the traffic they used to carry climbed instead toward the toll plaza and the deck above it. That slow draining away of the old crossing, rather than any single dramatic closure, is the truer picture of how one age gave way to the next here. And it is the thread that carries forward into everything the bridge would go on to witness. Decade after ordinary decade, once the last ferry horn had sounded for the final time. You would not have noticed the exact morning it happened because there wasn't one. The bay simply rearranged itself the way a room does when a piece of furniture is moved, and after a while nobody can say when the old arrangement stopped feeling normal. The automobile had already won the argument before the bridge was finished. The bridge only made the argument impossible to ignore. Where the ferries had carried people in unhurried batches, timed to boat schedules and tide, the deck above the bay now carried them in a steady, continuous pour at whatever hour they chose to come. And the number of them did not level off the way the planners had modestly hoped it might. It kept climbing. If you had stood at the toll plaza on almost any evening through those first years, you would have felt it before you understood it. A low, unbroken hum of engines idling toward the booths, headlamps stacking up in the dusk further back than anyone had thought to build for. The bridge had opened with two decks doing two different jobs, and for a long while that arrangement held. The upper deck carried automobiles both ways, and the lower deck carried a more mixed traffic entirely. Trucks, buses, and the electric interurban trains that still linked the East Bay towns to the city, cars that many people now alive had never ridden and can scarcely picture, gliding along rails set into the same lower roadway that trucks rattled over beside them. You would have heard both at once down there if you had leaned over the rail on the upper deck and let the sound rise up to you. The trucks in low gear, and beneath that, a lighter, more electrical note, wheels on steel rail, gone in a few seconds and then coming again. It is worth pausing on that sound, because it did not last. Ridership on those trains had been falling for years, drained away by the same private automobiles pouring across the deck above, and the lines that had once justified their own rails on the bridge were, one by one, judged not worth the cost of keeping. There is nothing you need to hold on to here, only the shape of it, a quiet redundancy settling in. One more example of the older way of crossing giving ground to the newer one. The same slow tide that had already emptied the ferries. By the time the last of those trains made its final run across the lower deck, the tracks themselves were lifted out, and the whole of the lower level was given over to automobile traffic, one way now, so that the upper deck carried the flow toward the city and the lower deck carried it back toward the towns on the far shore. It is a small piece of engineering that most people who use the bridge today never think about, because it feels as though it must always have been this way, the two decks running in their two directions like a matched pair. It was not always this way. It was the outcome of a slow argument about how much of the bridge's capacity should still be given to rail, decided the way most such arguments are decided, not by a single ruling but by years of numbers, riders falling on one side of the ledger and automobiles rising on the other, until the answer became obvious to everyone at more or less the same time. The tolls tell a version of the same story if you care to follow them. What a driver paid to cross in those early years would strike you now as almost nothing. A handful of coins passed through a window to a toll collector standing in a booth in all weather. And for those first years, before crossings became automatic and unremarkable, there was a kind of small ceremony to it. The window rolled down, the exchange, the gate lifting, the deck opening out ahead. That toll rose over the decades, in steps too small and too gradual for any single one of them to feel like an event, the same way the traffic itself grew, not by leaps, but by a kind of geological patience, each year's total resting on the last. If you drove across today and tried to explain the fare to someone who had paid the very first toll in 1936, you would need several sentences just to make the number make sense to them. And even then, you would be describing a different bay, a different region, a different scale of daily life built entirely on the assumption that the crossing would always be there, always open, always carrying whatever the shore on either side needed carried. Out on the water below, what remained of the old ferry trade had by then thinned to almost nothing worth the name. A few of the boats stayed on for other work, hauling freight or running short local routes that never depended on the bridge's business, but the great cross-bay fleet that had once timed its schedules to the rhythms of two growing cities simply had no purpose left to serve. The captains, who had spent their working lives reading the currents between the two shores, did not vanish all at once either. Some of them stayed with the water in other capacities, tugs and barges and the unglamorous freight that a working harbour always needs moved, watching the bridge from below the way a retired dancer might watch a stage they no longer perform on. It is one of the quieter griefs of this story, if grief is even the right word for it, that the crossing they had known better than anyone alive was replaced not by a rival, but by something built directly over the water they had worked, so that for the rest of their lives the bridge's shadow fell across the very lanes their boats used to run. But what does it actually take to keep a structure like this alive year upon year, once the ribbon has been cut and the speeches are long forgotten and nobody left standing at the toll plaza remembers the crowds from opening day? A bridge of this size does not simply sit and wait for use the way a building does. It moves constantly, in ways too slow and too small for a driver crossing it to feel, expanding and contracting with the heat of the day, swaying by a slight deliberate margin in the wind, settling by fractions into foundations that were never expected to stop settling entirely. Somebody has to watch all of that, season after season, and somebody did. If you had climbed the cables or walked the catwalks in those working decades, harnessed and moving at the pace the job demanded rather than the pace you would have liked, you would have joined a trade that never really finished its work because a structure exposed to salt air and fog for that many years is fighting corrosion every hour of its existence, whether anyone is watching or not. The ironworkers and painters who kept the bridge through those middle decades were doing something closer to tending a living thing than finishing a project, inspecting rivets and later bolts, chipping away rust before it could spread, laying down fresh coats of paint in a color chosen partly for how well it would hide the grime of that industrial waterfront, and partly because someone once simply thought it looked right against the fog. One of the riggers who had gone up during the original construction, one of the many whose names no roster preserved for us, stayed on for years afterward in the maintenance crews, or so the pattern of hiring at the time makes reasonable to imagine. Men who already knew the structure's temperament, its particular sway in a westerly wind, its groan when the temperature dropped hard overnight, were worth more to keep than to lose. You do not have to remember any of that to feel the shape of it. A bridge is never actually finished being built. It is only handed over quietly from the crews that raised it to the crews that would spend the rest of their lives keeping it standing. The fog that had troubled the original builders never went away either. And if you had worked a maintenance shift on the towers on a bad morning, you would have known it the way the ironworkers had known it years before. The horizon gone, the deck below reduced to a hum of unseen traffic, the paint gun in your hand slick with a dampness that never seemed to leave the steel entirely dry. Ships still moved beneath the spans, freighters and tankers finding their way through the shipping channels the piers had been so carefully sighted to respect, their own foghorns answering the bridge's fog signals in a kind of call and response that the whole bay had learned to sleep through. And so the decades passed this way, ordinary in the truest sense. Traffic thickening, paint renewed, tolls climbing by degrees, the old ferry trade fading into something people had to be told about rather than something they remembered. The structure quietly absorbing the weight of a whole region's daily life without asking for applause for doing it. And what happens to a bridge built to the standards of one age when the ground beneath it eventually decides to test those standards for real? For more than 50 years, the answer to that question remained theoretical. A set of assumptions in old drawings about how much shaking the piers and the trusses could absorb before something gave. The bay sits on ground that has never made any secret of its restlessness, and everyone who had built along its edges knew that a serious earthquake was not a matter of if, but of when. The way anyone living near a river knows a flood will eventually test the levee, no matter how many quiet years pass in between. Still, when the evening finally came, in the autumn of 1989, with the World Series being played not far away and the whole region's attention turned toward a ballpark rather than the ground underneath it, nobody crossing the bridge in that hour had earthquake standards on their mind at all. They had commutes on their mind and dinners waiting and the ordinary small business of getting from one shore to the other that the bridge had performed so reliably for so long that its reliability had become invisible. The shaking that reached the bridge that evening was not the worst the bay could produce, but it found the one place in the whole structure where the original design and a later expansion met imperfectly, a section of the eastern approach where an upper roadway gave way and dropped onto the deck below it, closing the crossing in an instant to the very traffic it had carried without incident for more than half a century. If you had been on that stretch of deck in the seconds before, you would have felt the whole roadway begin to move beneath you in a way utterly unlike wind or weight of traffic, a rolling, grinding motion with no pattern to it, and then, somewhere close by, a sound unlike anything the bridge had made before, steel and concrete finding a load path nobody had drawn for them. It is not a moment this story needs to dwell on longer than the truth requires. The bridge as a whole did not fail, and the vast majority of its length carried no damage at all. But the part that did fail closed the whole crossing for weeks and closed a certain kind of innocence about the structure for good. Every account of it repeats roughly the same lesson, calmly stated by the engineers who studied it afterward. A structure raised to one era's understanding of the ground it stood on will eventually meet a test drawn up by a later era's understanding, and the space between those two understandings is exactly where the damage will be found. The repair that followed was itself a long, patient piece of work, not unlike the original construction in miniature, closing off a length of deck, rebuilding the failed connection, testing it, and reopening the crossing to traffic that had, in the meantime, discovered other ways across the bay and been forced to remember how much they had always depended on this one. But the deeper answer to what the earthquake had asked took far longer to arrive, because studying the shaking led, in time, to the decision that the whole of the eastern half of the bridge, the long approach reaching back toward the towns on the far shore, should not simply be patched but replaced outright, built anew alongside the old one to a standard the original engineers could not have designed to, because the knowledge required to do it did not yet exist in their time. That new eastern span rose slowly, decades after the earthquake that had made it necessary, a single soaring tower where the old cantilever had marched along on a chain of them, and when it finally opened, the old eastern trusses that had carried the weight of the region for most of a century were taken down piece by piece, the reverse of everything the original ironworkers had once put up so carefully. If your eyes have already drifted closed somewhere in the last few minutes, that is exactly the right thing to have happened, because what remains of this story is less an event than a kind of settling. The western half of the bridge, the great double suspension spans that had troubled the water so much during construction, carried on largely unaltered through all of this, strengthened here and there against future shaking but never rebuilt outright, still resting on the same piers the divers and the caisson crews had fought the bay to found so many decades before. Traffic still pours across it every day in numbers the original engineers never imagined, tolls collected now without a hand ever passing through a window, the fog still arriving on its own schedule with no more respect for the bridge's age than it ever had for its youth. Ships still pass beneath it. Gulls still ride the updrafts along its towers. And somewhere in the maintenance records that nobody but a handful of engineers will ever read closely, the bridge continues to be watched, inspected, repainted and quietly kept, the way it always was and, in all likelihood, always will be for as long as the region on either shore has any need of a way across. I think that is a good place to leave it for tonight. Thank you for spending this stretch of your evening with me and with this bridge, all these decades of steel and fog and ordinary crossings. If you drifted off somewhere along the way and missed how it ended, that is no trouble at all. The story will keep, and it will still be here whenever you next want to hear the rest of it, or hear it again from the beginning. There are other great structures waiting quietly for their turn, if ever you find yourself lying awake looking for one. For now, though, there is nothing left to hold on to. Nothing you need to carry with you into sleep except whatever image is still drifting behind your closed eyes. The fog on the towers, perhaps, or a light moving slowly across dark water. Rest well. I'll be here next time.